Okay, I think we're going to get started again. So just a quick reminder, my name is Dawn Richards. I'm the Director of Patient and Public Engagement at CTO. And I think, first of all, I would just like to very briefly introduce our Patient and Public Advisory Group. That our members are sitting at this table here to the left. Maybe you guys could wave. You don't have to stand up. And one of them is actually on the panel as well. So thank you. I just wanted to give them a shout out. And to let you know that with their input and that of other patients, patient organizations, and health charities, this is the first of 2 sessions at our conference that we built really with patients and the public in mind. Over the past year or so, we've really heard a lot about how hard it is to find and join a clinical trial. And we heard that this morning too. And I really ask that you remember this when you go back to your work. Your work really does impact people that you hear from on the panel today and others like this out there. We're pleased to be live streaming and recording this session in our efforts to bring programming to the public today. And I'd like to introduce you to my good colleague, our moderator and first speaker, Bev Heim-Myers here, who is the CEO of the Huntington Society. And Bev, as you may know, is a tireless advocate and voice for people and their families who live with Huntington disease. And I'm so pleased that you're here with us today, Bev, and I'll pass it off to you to take over the panel now.
Thanks, Dawn. And thank you very much for inviting me today to speak. This is a real honor, and I was here last year and loved it, so it's great to be invited back. Thanks very much. Before I start speaking, I am going to, well, I'll just go back one, introduce you to all the panel participants. And then we're just going to come up. When one finishes, the next one's going to come up. So we'll start with myself, and then we're going to move to John Peter Bradford. John is, I'm going in this order. John is a cancer survivor, a former caregiver, and a CEO of Lifesaving Therapies. His lived experience has made him passionate about his work. John Peter will share his experiences with clinical trials and clinical trial reform as it relates to precision medicine. Our next speaker, Michelle Greiver. Michelle is a family physician and researcher. Michelle, along with a networker of 350 family physicians, uses electronic health records to recruit participants for clinical trials. This is a new approach in Canada that Michelle's happy to tell us about. Our next speaker will be Kirby Kim. Kirby is a caregiver representative and contributing member of Neuroblastoma Canada. Kirby will talk about his experience finding clinical trials for his daughter. He will also share his thoughts on patient-centric approaches. Our next speaker, Tina Cerrone. Tina is a Clinical Trials Ontario patient and Public Engagement Advisory Group member. Today, Tina will share her experience of having stiff syndrome, finding a clinical trial, and being in a clinical trial. And finally, Sarah Kahn. Sarah is the Patient Education and Support Manager of Ontario Region for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society of Canada. Sarah will talk about the patient services offered and share stories of patients who have benefited from services. And we start with me. So today I'm going to talk to you briefly about making it easier for patients and family members. I'll say patients, but I include patients and family members in that statement. How to make it easier for them to participate and understand clinical trials. And I'm speaking from the Huntington Society of Canada perspective, what we have done. And most of what we have done has started with the families telling us this is what we need. Meaningful engagement is two-sided. We need to, and this is what we get from our families, we need to understand that clinical trials do not happen without people. The focus needs to be on participant needs to ensure we get recruitment up front and we retain the families, especially in a disease like Huntington, and there's many diseases that are very complicated. There are a lot of barriers to clinical trial participation, and there's a huge burden with the disease. We need to respect the expertise of the family members and of the patients. They're the voice of the lived experience. That's the voice that we need to listen to when we're moving forward. We need to work with pharma and industry to include the patient perspective, to include the patient perspective in early protocol setting, to understand the burden of any disease, to understand what it really means to be a caregiver, to understand that it's difficult for a young mom of 3 kids to bring her own mother, who is symptomatic with HD, who she's been caregiving for since she was 16 years old, to take her on an hour trip to a clinical trial. There's all sorts of things that happen in that car ride. And pharma needs to understand that when they're setting up clinical trials and what they have to consider for the families. We need to value and educate the patient voice when creating tools for the clinical trial protocols, and both industry and patients need to be educated about each other's needs. Preparing for clinical trials. We realized there's been clinical trials going on for Huntington disease for a long time, but in the pipeline, there are 2 years ago or 3 years ago, there was 2 very promising trials. We realized that we needed to prepare our community and our clinicians for those clinical trials. So we created the HD Consortium. We've had 5 meetings to date, so this went back almost 5 years ago now. We created, from that, the first meeting, the members that were there were family members, there were clinicians, there were research assistants, there was industry, there was staff. Walking away from that, we were told we needed to create a clinical trial checklist that was Huntington specific but general so that we could share it. We need to prepare a clinical trial preparation guide, a mentorship program so seasoned clinicians could mentor new clinicians coming into clinical research, and a clinical trials map. We walked away from that thinking, okay, we are not a big staff. We are a small organization with a $4 million revenue generation annually. How are we going to do this? But we did it because of a great team and great people and great volunteers and great family members who advised us the best way to do it. We have family and patient representation for all aspects of this HD Consortium. They've helped inform the preparation of every guide we've created so that the language is easy for everybody to understand, not only the clinicians, but the patients, so that it's not divisive, it's inclusive. They've been included in all of the meetings we've had, the HD Consortium meetings, and with the executive, when we have our meetings and preparing for our next meeting and all the updates, family members are always on those calls. They keep us incredibly honest. Our next steps in clinical trial preparation, we're creating modules for clinicians, for new clinicians who have not done clinical trials, where we have the mentorship program. What's really missing is some sort of accreditation or modules or something for them to better understand the clinical trial process, especially if there's a medical procedure and they're not that comfortable. Pharma's not going to really come to them unless they've been prepared for that. So we'll create a training program where there's modules, and then they work with the seasoned clinicians. Even if they're not running the clinical trial, they'll get experience so that they can be candidates for running a clinical trial in the future, which will be here. And also a clinical trial decision guide. So I know today we've heard about the integrated consent model, but we want to create a decision guide. And this is being driven by the families. So that this guide, the decision guide, is more about, okay, this is this clinical trial that's coming, that's in the pipeline that we're going to start recruiting for. If you participate in this clinical trial, you may not be able to participate in this other clinical trial. Like, educate and be there to answer the questions. It's not just informed consent. It is decision making and helping somebody make the best decision for them and for their family members. One thing that we just created, we rolled out in September, came from knowing that we were going to have, that we had clinical trials in the pipeline. And I was at a meeting 2 years ago with my counterpart in the US, and we were talking about the new clinical trials coming and how exciting it was for the community. And what I said to her was, you know, what we need to do is create a group an international group of family members, patients, family members, that are educated and that can inform clinical trials going forward. So we created it. 4 members from Canada, 6 members from the US, and 10 members from Europe. We had our first meeting in England, London, England, in February. It was unbelievable. 2 days of training. They got to meet some clinical trial participants and the PIs for clinical trials that are exciting clinical trials happening. And then on day 3, Roche asked if they could do an advisory board with this group of educated individuals. The key before we went into that advisory board was for them to realize they were the experts, for our family members to know that they were experts. They didn't have to know about the clinical trials, they didn't have to know about protocols, but they were absolute experts in this, and they needed to be comfortable with that. So we demystified clinical trials for them, and they went in feeling like the experts and sharing information of the lived experience with HD. It was an incredible meeting. The whole 3 days was an incredible meeting. And at the end of it, it was a game changer for both sides of the equation. The family members felt empowered, and the members from Roche who are moving into a phase 3 clinical trial that looks at the root cause of Huntington disease were educated and appreciated the burden of the disease and what they need to consider moving forward to ensure recruitment and retention. Another thing, and this was brought up earlier, we need our community to understand research in lay language and good research. There's a whole bunch on the web. Our community goes to HD Buzz. It was created in 2010. 2 researchers came to myself and my counterpart in the US. They said, would you fund us to create a web portal of lay research that our community can go to and get the best understanding of research, clinical trials research. 200,000 views a year, or a month, and this is the go-to for not only our community, but for the family members and caregivers, healthcare providers, and other researchers. So it's really an incredible site. I encourage any of you to go to it. It's a wonderful, wonderful tool. Then the Genetic Non Discrimination Act, very quickly, was passed and received royal assent in May 2017. Our community came to us 8 years ago and said, we will not participate in clinical trials unless you can guarantee that our genetic information will be protected. Canada was the only G7 country that didn't, and it's now law. However, it's being fought. So Quebec has referred it to the Quebec Appeals Court, so we're not out of the woods yet. At this moment in time, genetic test information, wherever you are in Canada, is protected, but we still have to fight. So the first stop is Quebec Appeals Court. If it's overturned there, it'll go to the Supreme Court of Canada. But this was a great step forward for all Canadians, and it took 8 years to get there. That's it for me. Were your files, Well, yeah, you've got 12 minutes. He's doing it at 10. You're okay.
All right. So thank you for having me. I want to tell you I hate doing this kind of talking, but in front of a lot of people. But I do it because I'm passionate about what I'm doing, and because I lived the experience of having cancer. I almost died. You'll see me drinking water because I have no saliva, because I had radiation to my throat and they cut out half my neck. So I don't have a lot of water, liquid in my throat. And I also can't enjoy a meal anymore, which is why I'm not so fat as I used to be. And my wife died of cancer. And I'm going to tell you those stories. But the thing I think we should start by knowing is that everyone in this room has one guaranteed thing that's going to happen in their life, and that is that they're going to die. People who are diagnosed with a lethal disease are pretty close to being able to know what the expiration date on their birth certificate is. You don't know if you haven't been diagnosed with a lethal disease. So I'm talking to you about, oh, I got slides, oh yeah. So And so I'm talking to you about lethal diseases. And I'm talking to you about treating lethal diseases. Well, lethal disease is you have a chance, 95% chance of dying within 2 years of diagnosis. That's the definition of it. And I'm talking to you about precision treatment or personalized treatment of lethal diseases. And I don't want to quibble about whether immunotherapy is a precision treatment or not, but basically all the new kinds of therapies is what we're talking about. So please hear everything I'm saying in that context. And I'm talking to you about what's doing right, about doing what's right medically, societally, and for the people involved. So ethics in its purest sense. So my basic idea is, if it comes up, it's one of those things. People with lethal diseases right now can go to a doctor and go through some rigmarole and find out if they can get assisted death if they want. So why can't people with lethal diseases get assistance in living, extending their lives and living well? They can't right now. So I learned this advocacy stuff on the job. I was diagnosed with stage 3 squamous cell cancer of the throat. And my clinical trial experience, I'm not going to bother talking a lot about it. They did a CT scan and they thought it had metastasized to my stomach, someplace in my intestines, and that was going to be kind of like stage 4 and game over. But because I got in a clinical trial using 2 other imaging techniques, they found out that there was just a scar tissue. So they adjusted their treatment. In fact, we didn't have to go through the treatment that they were going to put me through, but we worked out a deal where I got a different treatment and I lived. During that time, my wife, we ran our business together, and she became my caregiver. I'm standing here, she's dead. She was so moved by what happened and how we navigated through the Ottawa hospital system that she quit working with me half-time and went down and started a cancer coaching program at the Ottawa Regional Cancer Foundation. And she lived and breathed this. She helped people get back to work. She helped them navigate the system. She helped them deal with the emotional issues associated with learning they may be dying and stuff like that. But one day she came home, she said, I'm really tired. It was my 70th birthday. I'm 75 now. It was my 70th birthday the next week, and she was making cakes and stuff and having red balloons, and she was going to have a big party for me. And I hate parties, so I wasn't helping much. So she got up one morning, and she went to go to the bathroom, and she couldn't get from the bed to the bathroom, and she fell down on the floor in agony. She's a very tough lady. She'd just toughed through what she thought was exhaustion and a little pain in her back. 7 hours later, we came out of the hospital. She had cancer in her lungs, in her liver, in her bones, and throughout her lymphatic system. And she was told, go home to die. And we're talking about her now. And so by pulling strings and banging on people's doors and screaming at them, we got a biopsy done very quickly. We eliminated all the other cancers we could possibly eliminate. And we found out she had adenocarcinoma of the lung, ALK-positive mutation, which means that she had a very rare form of cancer that afflicts 87% of the people who get it are women, healthy women, who don't smoke, who have never smoked, who have never had secondhand smoke, have not had radon in it in their lives, but they get it and they die. So I found out that there was this drug, which didn't have a name at the time. It turns out it was called crizotinib, and now it's called Xalkori, available in a clinical trial. And we tried to get her in the clinical trial, and she was accepted in that clinical trial. And then I got a phone call. I made a bed for her in the car because we had to drive to Oshawa from Ottawa, 4-hour drive. Had the bed in, she was in the bed, we were about to leave, and my cell phone rang, and it was a clinical trial nurse manager saying, sorry, your wife can't come to the trial. Why? Well, she got crizotinib first, and she's not allowed to get crizotinib first. No, sorry, that was a different trial, But she was treated with something first that precluded the crizotinib. And it was a small little treatment that she had. It was just a stopgap treatment until we could get some stuff fixed. But because the order was important in the exclusion and inclusionary criteria, they told her she couldn't go. Even though I asked, what's the evidence that shows that order makes a difference? Oh, there is none. It's just that the lawyers don't like it, the idea. So we ran our own trial with a number one, N of 1. I called the president of Pfizer and got crizotinib through this special access program. It worked like a miracle. She took it. 2 days later, she was walking 45 minutes. 4 months later, it stopped working. We did this 4 separate times. Her life, which was expected to be 3 weeks, turned out to be 16 months. 15 and a half of those months, she would tell you, were simple, happy life. She had her grandchildren. She had me, you know. She had others in her life. When she died, before she died, she said to me, I'm special. One of the drugs she got, she was the first person in North America to get that drug. It had just entered phase 2 trial in the States. But off trial, she was the first person in North America to get it. She said other people should get it. So I said, okay, I will try to help other people get it. So that's what I do now, full time almost. And so I want to tell you that when you are having a lethal disease, you're looking down the barrel of a gun from the wrong end, and the risk-reward ratio is radically different. Radically different. You'll try anything, because you're going to die anyway. I don't have time to go through the detail of it, but I run a group called the Lifesaving Therapies Network, which is dedicated to trying to change things so people with lethal diseases can get drugs faster. For this purpose, for the purposes of the clinical trials, we need to expand access. I see it's 3:16 here, by the way, so I'm going by this clock, not yours. We need to expand access. We have to change exclusionary trials. We have to get people who are sick drugs faster, and we have to change the way clinical trials are run. And with precision medicines and personalized medicines, there are different ways we have to do it. The statistics are different, the design is different, the way if you're playing, the way you exclude and exclude, whether you use randomization, all these other things can become different. We've published 2 papers, one in the Journal of Clinical Cancer Research, the one coming out this week in the Journal of Cancer Medicine, talking about this. One is called, it doesn't matter, but they're in these journals if you want to look them up. Dr. David Stewart's the main author. I'm one of the flunky authors on the back of it. So I've already said this. We need to tailor the protocols of precision medicines, precision medicine trials, to fit the nature of the treatments. And I don't have time to tell you the detail of that, but I will if you ask me questions. We must include quick access. We have to run trials as if when people are in their homes, so we have access to real-world data. We have to have distributed trials, not trials in a hospital all the time. We have to have virtual trials. We have to have just-in-time accreditation for the doctors. All kinds of stuff, which I can tell you about. But I'm down now to the yellow light, which is scaring me. It takes $2 billion to get a drug in 12 years. If we do it in breakthrough, that comes down to 8 years and two-thirds of $2 billion. But for every year of clinical trial, and this is the thing we just published, Every 12 seconds of regulatory and clinical research process, 1 life year is lost. 2.5 million a year in North America and 35 million a year worldwide. What's a life year? A life year is 12 months of a life. 12 people living 1 month, one person living 12 months, or anything in between that. That's outrageous when you're talking about a lethal disease. How many lives do you save? Because everybody says, well, you save lives, that's why you do these trials. 684. 2.5 million, 684. Make sense? Not to me. What we need is what I call whack-a-mole research protocols, which I'll talk about later if you'd like, and a progress-centered regulatory framework, which takes into account everything I've talked about. Thank you very much.
Hello? Okay. So I was very moved by Mr. Bradford. I don't know if anybody else was, but you're the reason why we're doing this. Thank you. So I'm Michelle Greiver. I'm a family doc. I come from the world of real-world data, and I'll tell you a little bit about finding out about trials in family medicine and what we're currently setting up to enable us to do this. First, I'll talk a little bit about practice-based research networks, because I'm the acting director of UTOPIAN, which is one of the large ones. PBRNs, practice-based research networks, they're really an alliance between primary care clinicians, family docs, social workers, nurse practitioners, etc., and researchers, breaking down the barriers. Okay? We aim to answer questions that are relevant to primary care practice, and I think we shouldn't be limited to that. We improve quality as well in family practice. We work with our colleagues in QI programs. There's opportunities in our networks to increase research skills. We help to teach people, clinicians, about research, and we benefit from linkages with experienced researchers. Why am I talking to you about that? There's been a change in family medicine and in medicine in general in Canada. We've got electronic medical records. So what does that mean? We have lots of data, lots of data. 85% of family practices are now computerized. Okay? So the size and scope dramatically increased in Canada and worldwide, elsewhere as well. We have relationships with clinicians. I'm a family doc. I know the other family docs in my community. You know, we're not something foreign that they don't know about. We are them and they are us. And we have an interest in EMR data to support our activities and to collect and manage. These data are de-identified. So we don't collect names of physicians, of patients, etc. We're pretty careful about managing privacy and confidentiality and security of the data. Because of all this, we've emerged as quite important players in the secondary use of EMR data and recruitment of patients. By secondary use, I mean use beyond direct care of the patient. And that's something that's been increasing both in Canada and across the world. This is my network, UTOPIAN. We've got 14 academic sites, so we're part of the Department of Family and Community Medicine at University of Toronto, the largest in Canada. There's 400 practices, there's 1,400 physicians. There's about 1 million patients we look after. And some of these physicians now increasingly contributing data. These are the locations of practices contributing data in the GTA and around, so we're a regional network. Okay. The database, I just had an update from a data manager, currently 550,000 patient records and rising fast, so a 10% increase in the last 6 months. And we not only collect and manage data, we share it after approval. So the physicians who are providing these data know that the data are being forwarded. We tell them, they have the options to opt out. The patients are informed about this. There's posters in the waiting room, and they can tell us, no, I don't want anything to do with this. Patients can opt out. So you can see the data are first extracted to the UTOPIAN data safe haven, directly from the EMRs, and then they're forwarded to ISIS for linkage with administrative data. They're forwarded to CIPSIN, the Canadian Primary Care Sentinel Surveillance Network, and they're joined with data from 13 other centers in a national database. And they're also forwarded to Diabetes Action Canada to form a national diabetes repository. Okay. This is not limited to Canada. This is an example in the UK, the Royal College of General Practitioners. PBRNs and data management are worldwide enterprises. We do not share data with our colleagues in the UK, but we have a study currently comparing data. We run the same queries in each of our databases. How does this work for invitation? It is de-identified, right? So we can't really say, oh, we'd like to invite Mr. Smith to a trial. But what we can do is we can give information to researchers, we can give reports. Here's the number of patients in our database who potentially meet your study inclusion criteria. We have information on medications, blood pressure, gender, age, etc. So we can give them a rough count. We can return coded lists of patients to the site of care. So we can send just the codes back to the family docs or their teams, and they are allowed to re-identify these lists at the site of care. This is allowed under current legislation. We've done this. And they can verify the list. Should this patient be invited? Yes, they're potentially a good candidate, or no, there's other factors in their life that I think it's probably not the right time for them. And they can send letters of invitation, and we've done this. Okay, this is allowed. This is just an example of a small trial. We wanted to find out patients who are between the age of 40 and 70, living with type 2 diabetes or hypertension, you don't have poorly controlled sugar, blood pressure, or cholesterol, invited to a randomized controlled trial. Right? Either a group program where our social workers and dietitians help them address emotional factors related to food or usual care. This is an example of the types of invitations. Site 1 contributes to UTOPIAN. There are larger sites, so what did they have? They had more patients that we could easily identify as meeting potentially trial criteria. We needed between 10 and 20 patients per site. They had way too many, so we simply randomized the list and invited 230 patients. Why 230 patients? It's known that in primary care, roughly between 10 and 15% will respond to an invitation. Site 2 had an EMR that was well structured, very careful about it. They were able to identify and invite enough patients. They met their recruitment criteria. Site 3, EMR only, not able to. Did not identify enough patients. Those they identify did not meet study criteria and they dropped out. Okay, there's the result. There's a response rate, and you can see 11% were invited. So it works, and we've used it for other trials. This is a larger trial that was recently funded by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, $1 million. Using quality improvement to help improve care for complex elderly patients. What are we doing? We're using EMR data for recruitment and measurement. Okay. As part of this study, we needed to identify complex patients. Well, what's a complex patient? I don't know. What's a complex patient? We have data from ISIS showing us that there's a direct correlation between the number of medications older patients take and persisting complexity. They're going to be complex and high cost every year for 3 years. This is due to work done by my co-investigator, Dr. Simone DeRouche and Dr. Walter Watkes, using data at ISIS. We use the data we have. Right? There's a positive predictive value. 2/3 of patients we identify because they're older, 65 or more, they've been prescribed 10 or more drugs, are likely to be persistently complex. Should these patients not be invited to a trial? We think they should. We are also part of Diabetes Action Canada. This is a $35 million trial. There's lots of researchers, etc. And UTOPIAN is, I would say, the major part in the formation of the National Diabetes Repository with participation from Alberta and Quebec. This repository is intended to inform not only observational studies, what's happening to patients who live with diabetes, but also interventional studies. How can we prevent blindness in children who live with type 1 diabetes? And this is currently underway. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My name is Kirby Kim, and I'm actually quite excited to present here in front of you all, especially pertaining to the pediatric case here. So when I say I'm excited here, what I actually mean is I'm quite nervous, so let's see how this thing turns out. So 8 years ago, yesterday, as a matter of fact, we had one sentence that changed our world like I could not have imagined in a million years, and that's, your daughter has cancer. During those early days, we had no idea what cancer was. Okay, so cancer is bad, and if it was stage 4, we know that it had metastasized and that it was going to be difficult. Thankfully, we didn't really realize how challenging our lives were going to be, nor did we understand the impact that it would have on our lives. Clinical trial ultimately saved my daughter's life. In fact, about a month ago, we celebrated 4 years from being outside the last therapy. So today I want to talk to you about what it was like to have and traverse through the clinical cancer world. I wanted to give you an insight into what it's like to navigate through the medical system, both in Canada as well as the United States. I want to provide you with this information because although you may have some inkling as to what it might be like, perhaps not in the intimate way that I would like to present here. It's important for me to share this information because it is an example of what we have to deal with on the other side. Ultimately, I hope to paint part of the picture that presents the community of patients in clinical trials. I'll be using slides as well as a backdrop to tell the personal story. And by the way, that's my daughter there. But they're not explicitly tightly coupled, so they're there to just give our history. So please don't be alarmed if it doesn't match exactly what I say. Okay, there we go. So it's clear that without clinical trials, my daughter would have succumbed to the diseases. We understood the importance of clinical trials and family like ours, the implications that had meant for us. Each day we live with the gratitude. We also live with the long-term effect of clinical trials and therapies. Our experiences have been very heavy and costly. Nevertheless, we're the lucky ones. Our journey began when we declined irradiating the primary tumor bed as required by the protocol. Regrettably, because of hepatic veno-occlusive disease, we could not risk damaging the liver any further. Falling off the protocol was one of the many devastating events that followed. What was very shocking to me at that point was when we were off the protocol, there was no substantive support for us. What do we do now? The only option available to us was palliative care, and we weren't ready to accept that. So, of course, we rolled up our sleeves and started looking. What was it going to be? Was that the Gerson therapy, high-dose vitamin C, green tea extracts, cannabis, mushrooms, curcumin, mistletoe, blue scorpion venom, etc., etc., Bertinsky, and even anti-neoplastins? You see, by this time, we understood enough to know that how devastating the therapies were. It's something else to watch your own daughter suffer. It's another thing altogether to watch her scream, going through hemorrhagic cystitis. We almost lost Maya in our first transplant. If there were alternative therapies that were available, we were more than willing to look at them. Our motto was, if it does not harm, try them. It's important to also note where we were in terms of our personal level. The career that I had built over the course of the past 20 years was stalled or parked in some nondescript and non-critical role. Thankfully, my employers understood. The stress of having a gravely ill child also took its toll on my relationship. Ultimately, it caused my marriage. Because of the illness, my son grew up alone, on his own, for nearly 4 years. We were constantly just one breath away from losing all and unraveling. And when time permitted, we did unravel. At times, the greatest accomplishment of the day was simply being able to get out of bed. When things were really bad, I meditated up to 3 hours, and I found meditation to be my salvation. Everything that I thought was concrete in my life evaporated, and its place, anger, fear, exasperation, helplessness, took its place. And it was barely constrained but under the surface. In the midst of this chaos and personal chaos that we were experiencing, the children that we got to learn, got to meet, and got to love, were dying like flies around us. This was our existence. This is the place from which we must make life and death decisions for our daughter. We first reached out to Sloan Kettering. Because Maya had so much tumor burden left, we were declined. I must admit that I felt a certain amount of relief because now I didn't have to go out and somehow figure out how to gather $350,000 for the initial retainer that was required. And that would be just a start. We also know that the application to the Ministry of Health was going to be unsuccessful, most likely. We needed to appeal their decision, and at that moment, we did not have the wherewithal to take on this additional burden. Subsequently, we contacted Dr. Giselle Scholler and were accepted in a personalized medicine with NMTRC in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Finding this trial was based largely due to the neuroblastoma families on Facebook. What we were not expecting was a sense of competition and tension between two organizations. The correspondence between researchers and doctors seemed strained. Our primary care team seemed overly concerned about potential issues rising while we were in transit from Canada to US. Why suddenly? I don't know. And what were they proposing in its place? I found this to be completely and utterly distasteful. Of course, being Canadians, we would rather have treatment in Canada. Primarily, there wasn't an appropriate clinical trial available for Maya. Additionally, we didn't even know where to look. We knew that there were a couple of trials that were open in our primary hospital, but that was about it. Secondly, we have socialized medicine, and we would not be required to carry the heavy financial burdens, except that's not what actually happened. We were declined by Ministry of Health for personalized medicine, and when Dr. Scholler heard about this, she referred us to NIH. There was a parallel study that was being conducted, and the cost of the therapy and the lodging and the food and traveling was carried out by U.S. government. It's not hard to be cynical when U.S. government carries our cost of therapy when Canada, this great nation, would not cover us, the Canadians. With respect to personalized medicine, ultimately we were rejected from the study because we could not locate fresh tumor sample. Irinotecan and Temodol were working, and in this case, it was working against us. Next was MIBG-131 therapy. We were ready to apply to CHOP when we found out that there was actually an MIBG center in St. Justine in Montreal. We found this through another neuroblastoma family. We watched carefully, and we followed suit shortly thereafter. Some 6 or 7 months later, when we were just beginning to enroll in a DFMO trial with Dr. Scholler again, Maya was diagnosed with Myelodysplastic syndrome, a secondary malignancy. And it's most likely from the MIBG therapy. Knowing the challenges that were existing for high-risk kids, our hopes faded very quickly. Back at our primary hospital, we were transferred from solid tumor group to hematology oncology. Once again, we rolled up our sleeves and started again. More scientific literatures, new concepts to learn, and newer worries about our child. This time, we didn't have that brave face. From the clinical side, we could see that the oncologists have all but given up on Maya. There were so few kids with MDS. It's an adult disease, and there's so little literature about pediatric settings. As acididine has been useful in adult setting, but it was not well known how it worked in pediatric case. Our only curative therapy was another bone marrow transplant, the therapy that almost cost my daughter's life. Difficult, challenging were the terms used to describe an almost a certain outcome. By this time, we also understood that we were running out of options. All the wild cards that we tried to have in our back pockets were being exhausted. Additionally, I was also aware with each therapy we were trying, we were exhausting Maya's body. Chemotoxicity was constantly on my mind. How do we provide the most amount of life for Maya? When Maya relapsed with azacitidine, we applied and got accepted at St. Jude with the help of an amazing and persistent oncologist. She treated Maya like her own. Cure therapy was the right therapy for Maya. It provided us with desperately needed bone marrow transplant, and with me being the haplotransplant donor. It was also non-myeloablative, meaning that the amount of chemo that was being used was less. Even so, Maya did not make it almost, and the recovery was very slow, and we suffered one setback after another. The girl who ran down the bone marrow transplant halls in January could hardly take 1 or 2 steps within a couple of months. The sparkle that once defined Maya was replaced with dark, dull eyes. We ran out of all running room. I do not believe that Maya could have survived another therapy. The researchers agreed, and there were many times where we thought that we would lose Maya. We had early birthday parties, and we struggled with allowing Maya one last Christmas before we entered our second transplant. We even discussed taking Maya to Sweden, Norway. We could not watch Maya suffer like the other children's. We had discussed taking Maya home in the middle of transplant when we thought that she was relapsing in the neuroblastoma direction. That was 4 years ago. And even though cancer had taken so much from my daughter, and because we found a way through clinical trials, we can still hold her hand and walk her to school. When I take a look back at what we had experienced, a couple of items that come to mind. Getting to the right clinical trial from this side of the fence is the hard work. Once you get there, you can let the clinical trials take over. We needed a lot of support, desperately. It seems unreasonable that there was so little support for the majority of the children's. And I'm out of time, so I guess I'll close by saying that we're grateful for having had the clinical trials available to us. It was a hard-fought battle, but in the end, we are part of the group that actually made it. And without additional support and the research in clinical trials, we would not be here. Thank you very much.
I'm a little bit nervous too, so. Thank you to CTO for inviting me to speak today. It's a privilege to share my perspective as a patient and speak at a conference that supports what has been a very significant factor in the current status of my health and indeed my future. Advocacy has become a very meaningful part of my life, and as a patient, I hope my experience in my clinical trial and my journey in overcoming my illness is useful in opening the dialogue further. Today, I'd like to share my story and how a serendipitous meeting with another patient is what ultimately led me to my own life-changing trial. When I was 27 years old, I was heavily involved in fitness and running races, so my routine was fairly regimented. It wasn't unusual for me to feel the usual pangs of exhaustion or fatigue, but during that time, I also started to experience symptoms that felt anything but normal. My legs often cramped, became rigid, and went into aggressive spasms. I chalked it up to my active lifestyle, but when they worsened, I decided to visit a doctor. I was told it was likely hyponatremia, a condition that occurs when the sodium is abnormally low in your blood. It seemed like a fair conclusion, so I kept going on with my day-to-day life, and I felt like I had dealt with the issue. I felt relieved. Months later, the symptoms got worse. My spasms weren't appearing after I worked out or during. They came on with zero predictability and a force that seemed to grow with every month that passed. My condition would eventually affect all the muscles in my body, including the respiratory muscles, making breathing near impossible. What was once a brief few minutes of spasms could now last for several hours. I was told maybe I should get tested for MS. I was given high doses of morphine and sedation drugs to compensate. This was the start of a journey into years and years of question marks, confusion, and fear. No one knew what was going on with my body, including myself. For the next 2 years, I went through multiple misdiagnoses, several procedures and tests, until a specialist at McMaster University Medical Center, whom I'll refer to as Dr. X, along with a consult of a doctor in the UK, determined I had a very rare acquired neurological disease called stiff person syndrome. Rarer still, it only affects 1 in a million people. Dr. X decided I needed an aggressive treatment protocol to help manage this disease, but it became evident early on that I wasn't responding to it. My dosages went higher, my treatments were increased, and I was averaging 3 to 5 emergency room visits a month. It affected little change. I was despondent and felt helpless. My parents and I knew we had to do something, but what else was there? On a whim, we went to the Mayo Clinic. It was an obvious choice given its pedigree, but sadly it gave us no answers. We were told there was little we could do, and we had exhausted every conventional treatment available. My only solution was more Versed, more propofol, more hospital visits. I stopped working, I lost my driver's license, I had to move back in with my parents to be under their care. Everything in my life was being taken away. Every month I had plasmapheresis treatments, and I developed a very strong bond with a wonderful nurse administering them. I confided in her often about my fears about my disease and what my future looked like. She listened, but more profoundly and serendipitously, she introduced me to Amy, another patient who was diagnosed with SBS and who successfully overcame the disease with a clinical trial at the Ottawa Hospital. Due to obvious confidential agreements, I couldn't know too much about Amy and her experience, but I was given a major lifeline in this moment that forever changed the course of my life. My nurse was optimistic that I could also access this clinical trial. All of a sudden, I had hope again. My parents and I approached Dr. X with this newfound information in the trial for SBS. He told us he was aware of the treatment and Amy, but he was very skeptical. Too risky, he said. I could die from this. He had doubts it would work, yet I don't believe he was fully informed of the potential this clinical trial could offer us. He told us it wasn't a viable solution. We took his word for gospel, and that's what many patients ultimately do. They believe their specialist has their best interest in mind, that they know what's best for you and your health. We relied strongly on the guidance and direction of Dr. X. We put all of our trust in his approach and his insights on how to hopefully get a grip on my condition. I had a good relationship with Dr. X, and in retrospect, I think I was afraid of jeopardizing that relationship if I went against his advice. I believed he was arming me with everything imaginable in order to regain some quality of life back. And truthfully, what did my family know about clinical trials? This was the first serious health crisis in our family, and it was immeasurably difficult for us to find resources to help us understand what our options were. There simply was nothing out there for us to do. In a way, we were living blind. At the end of the day, Dr. X was vocal, and he made it clear that he was very unsure of the clinical trial. We would later learn that he would not be actively involved in any part of the process. It was that time that we decided we would lean on Amy's experience to help us navigate our own. We didn't feel that Dr. X had my best interests at heart, and so we forged ahead on our path, and we connected with Amy once and for all. In 2011, we met Amy, call it fate, but Amy actually turned out to be friends with my sister-in-law's parents. It astounded us not only to know that she was someone connected to our family, but that she had the exact same rare disease. She understood exactly what I was going through. 14 months post-transplant, we met. It was remarkable. She was doing very well. She had seen significant improvements in her condition. Throughout the course of this new relationship and bond, I would learn that Amy was a determined, courageous, and strong advocate for herself. Her tireless research and drive is what led her to meeting Dr. Atkins. It was Amy who convinced a stem cell and bone marrow transplant expert and medical director that he had to perform a stem cell transplant on her. She knew this worked on different autoimmune diseases. She knew this transplant would stop our disease from progressing. Dr. Atkins listened to her. He applied the previous theories of a clinical trial for MS to SPS as baseline information to determine if he would move forward with this treatment for Amy, and he did. Amy is a pioneer, an exemplary model of what it means to be a patient and to be your own advocate. She changed the course of medical history, and together with Dr. Atkins, they achieved something that had never happened in the world before. Amy was the first person in the world to undergo this treatment, and I became the second. We went through every detail of the clinical trial with Dr. Atkins. It was very real, it was very frank. We knew the risks were high, but the way in which Dr. Atkins approached it was full of empathy and compassion. He knew my situation was dire, and he embraced my family and I with a lot of thoughtfulness and care. We finally felt like we were in the right hands, and the relief we felt was incredible. This treatment wasn't just going to change my fate and my future, but would positively affect all of those who cared and loved for me so dearly. I knew right away I was going to pursue this option the moment I began to feel hope, which had been missing in my life for years. My future started to take shape. The process of the stem cell transplant began, and throughout that time I relied heavily on Amy's generous insights. In May 2011, I became an incredibly grateful recipient of an autologous stem cell transplant, and today I've been in remission, long-lasting remission for 5 years. My life has been restored in the most positive and profound way, and I'm forever grateful. That was my personal story, and now I'd like to share what I've learned as a patient. Throughout my experience, I've seen firsthand the power and impact of the patient's voice and the importance of becoming your own advocate in your care. Patients have the resources to be aware, feel empowered, and in charge of their own health. My experience as a patient, now as a voice for advocacy, has given me the privilege to interact with a number of individuals who are battling their own health struggles. Individuals who are seeking access to clinical trials. As a result of that, to date, there have been 5 patients that Dr. Atkins has treated in his clinical trial, 3 of which were patients under the care of Dr. X. We have seen patients relying heavily on other patients' experiences to access information and resources. It can be very comforting and hopeful for patients to connect to others, but there needs to be a better balance of information online. If we can continue to inform the public in a way that is safe, effective, and ethical, more patients will benefit from the life-changing research. I believe that good communication with your physician is crucial for good health care. The physician-patient relationship can be a long-term one. It's important to have the trust in their expertise, but also feel that your needs and concerns are being heard and addressed. Only you, as the patient, know if the care you are receiving is helping you achieve the quality of life that you are trying to attain. We can all be an active member in our care. We can be informed patients, and by being an informed patient, it will help optimize the management of our diseases and conditions. We have an opportunity as patients to be a part of the process from research to clinical trial. We can meaningfully and actively collaborate with all of those who are involved, the patients, caregivers, researchers, and physicians, to help develop protocols to bring about positive change and ultimately strive to end the disease. Beyond the undeniably momentous fact that I'm here to speak to you today and looking forward to a long, healthy life, my story underscores the importance of clinical trials. I'm thankful every day for the confident commitment and dedication of the research physicians and other professionals working on our behalf to bring clinical trials to Ontario. Fortunate circumstance led me to the treatment I received, but I hope that my experience and the experience of many other patients will help change that for others in the future. Thank you.
So today's presentation is a brief overview of the Clinical Trial Support Services and Information Resource Center at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society of Canada. There's 138,100 Canadians living with or in remission from blood cancers. This doesn't even account for families and caregivers affected by someone with blood cancer. Our mission at the organization is to cure blood cancers and improve the quality of life for patients and their families. The LLSC is Canada's largest voluntary health organization dedicated to blood cancer patients. We provide support to patients at every step of their cancer journey and their families and caregivers. The LLSC is affiliated with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society in the U.S., and many of our information booklets, programs, and resources are shared services for Canadian patients, caregivers, and professionals. One of these shared services is the Information Resource Center, or the IRC. The center houses master-level oncology staff that includes social workers, nurses, and health educators. The assistance provided to you is available in English, Spanish, French, and a language line, which provides translation services in over 100 different languages. The IRC assists callers with questions about blood cancers and gives accurate, up-to-date disease and treatment information. Within the IRC is the Clinical Trial Support Center, which I'll be referring to as the CTSC. This is a unique resource both for the healthcare professionals and patients, as it helps them understand firstly what clinical trials are, which ones are available in Canada, and if appropriate, which ones are available in the US, and the support required to enroll in the trial with the consent of your healthcare provider. The process begins with callers contacting the IRC and stating that they seek help with clinical trials. Clinical trials are for people at every stage of blood cancers. This includes people with newly diagnosed or those with rare types of blood cancers. We do need to shift our thinking that clinical trials are a last resort in treatment. In fact, clinical trials provide patients the best treatment currently available or new, possibly more effective treatment. The CTSC offers a personalized approach to the patient, family, or family members requesting the information to find and enroll in a clinical trial. It's staffed by nurses with an expertise across all blood cancers and stem cell transplant. Nurses are specially trained in hematologic malignancies, clinical trials, and patient education support. Nurses help patients or caregivers in understanding and identifying clinical trials. Patients are provided with an individualized clinical trial list to discuss with their treating physician. Patients have direct access to their clinical trial nurse specialist for the duration of their clinical trial journey. So the level of support provided by the CTSC is immense. The first step is to find out why patients or family members are requesting this search and if there are any barriers to entering a clinical trial. The first phone call takes approximately 1 hour. The second step is to educate patients and family members about clinical trial phases and criteria. Next in the process is for the nurses to review previous treatments, medications, and medical history provided by the patients. The actual clinical trial search is conducted through clinicaltrials.gov, and this formal search is emailed to the patient or family member requesting the information. The CTSC has connections with multiple sites and can contact this site on the patient's behalf to obtain additional information for Canada and the US. Patients may have obstacles that prevent them from entering a clinical trial, such as limitations in traveling or living away from home, and that's quite a bit to manage, but we really want patients to enroll and feel empowered. In terms of Canadians using the CTSC services, there aren't that many Canadian patients connected to clinical trials through our services, as most major cancer centers offer in-house clinical trial support. However, there are many blood cancer patients that aren't near these centers that would benefit from this service, or there are smaller hospitals that have in-house. There's smaller hospitals that would benefit from this because they have oncology or chemotherapy day units. And within Canada, there's 197 interventional blood cancer clinical trials open and actively recruiting. This is for leukemia, lymphoma, myeloma, MDS, and MPN. I'm going to close with sharing one individual's experience with CTSC. Morag McLean was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia in January 2017 in Vancouver, BC. She started treatment at Vancouver General Hospital, and in that time she reached out to LLSC for support services, and my colleague Elaine Webb connected her to the First Connection peer-to-peer support program as a form of emotional support. Morag also contacted the CTSC to learn about clinical trial options. Within 48 hours of contacting the CTSC, she received a full list of clinical trial options in Canada and the US. The Director of Clinical Support Services in the US, Alyssa Gentile, arranged for Morag to speak to the team at Princess Margaret Hospital as one option. She also arranged for Morag to attend a NIH trial in Bethsaida, Maryland. This clinical trial was for Keytruda for refractory AML. Alyssa was instrumental in placing her in this clinical trial and providing her the necessary support. Trials at NIH in the US are free to Canadians, but the cost of travel and personal expenses have to be managed by the patient. In November 2017, Morag considered a second round of clinical trials at NIH. Her doctor advised her about serious chemotherapy side effects from this trial, or pursuing that second trial, and the risk of exposure to cold and flu, and possible infections that may occur as a result of travel. So she chose to celebrate her twin's birthday in late November and Christmas with her family. Instead of pursuing the second trial, she asked her hematologist in Vancouver to apply to have her approved for venetoclax and Mylotarg, and when she received this approval, it helped her feel that she made the correct decision in not going back to Maryland for a clinical trial. Morag passed away on January 11, 2018. Although a clinical trial didn't work effectively for Morag, this process isn't viewed as a failure. Her husband, Jonathan Oldman, expresses immense gratitude for the service and support provided by the organization. He feels she was gifted 7 months of life, more time with her family, kids, as she was provided hope, optimism, and the CTSC support services. Jonathan was so touched by the services provided, he wrote a thank you note to Alyssa in the US, in which he's expressed interest in widely promoting the CTSC, especially to Canadian patients. So thank you, Jonathan, for your permission to share this information today and creating that awareness amongst other blood cancer patients. The LLSC does have resources and supports for you and the potential to change the outcome of an individual's cancer journey.
What a panel. Thank you for your courage. And we have time for questions. As the box makes its way.
Thanks everyone for sharing your story. I'm actually, I've been connected on Twitter to the people that are on live stream, and we have a question from Bryn Robinson, who's in the Maritimes. This one actually is for you, Bev. Bryn is wondering if you can expand a bit on the training that was provided in London when you talked about the kind of 3-day meeting where people were brought together and training was provided. Could you expand on that for her, please?
So thank you. That's a great question. Thank you very much for it. The training first started with this group coming together. So we thought we'd have to do icebreakers with the group, and we didn't because they all told their story. And within 10 minutes, everybody had connected, and they were sharing unbelievable stories, very similar to the stories you've heard today. The training then, we talked about clinical trials and the phases of clinical trials, and we had an expert in Huntington disease research come in and talk to them in lay language and demystify the clinical trials and talk a little bit about why you may be excluded from a clinical trial, the process that we go through, the burden of clinical trials, what they need to think about. But I think the most important thing that we did was help them understand that when they're participating in any advisory boards, which is something that will continue as we go along, when they're participating, it's not about the questions they're asking. It's about the answers they want to give. So it was empowering them to understand that they are the experts. They are the experts of the lived experience of the disease. Many of them had participated in clinical trials before. So it was helping them understand that they just needed a little bit of understanding and the demystifying of clinical trials. And going forward, they're the expert advice that we needed. They needed to understand the information they wanted to share.
Yay, thanks.
You're welcome. We also took them, there's a clinical trial being done in London, England, that is lowering the Huntington protein, and we took them to the lab, and we had the entire team present to them, and it was a real connection with the PI and the others involved, so it was a great experience all around. Thank you. Any other questions? There's one in the back corner here.
Thanks very much. I'm actually find it interesting that we started today talking from Dr. Brian Goldman about the resistance to disruptive innovation that we sometimes see within the healthcare profession and the impact that had on the lived experience of the panel members today in their journey. So I thought that was very interesting. At the Hospital for Sick Children, we've actually implemented, as a result of a similar experience to that of Kirby, a patient and family clinical trial navigator, so that you don't have to just walk out and ask Professor Google on your own. You have some support. And I guess my question perhaps is this is an institution-based support for finding clinical trials and taking that next step along the journey that's independent of your healthcare team. It's an institutional resource. What responsibility do we have as academic health science centers? So, I'm talking about the big centers where if you have a very, very rare disease or are extremely ill, you're probably at one of our big hospitals that's affiliated with the university or something of that nature. What responsibility do we have as academic health science centers and learning institutions to support the journey of people trying to find clinical trials, because we may not always have them in-house? What would you have found helpful for those of you who have this experience at an institutional level? Would there have been anything that those large healthcare organizations could have done to help you on your journey and help you find assistance a little bit more easily?
Who wants to tackle that?
So I guess I could start with that. Thank you very much. I guess from my perspective, I could ask the question from the patient's perspective, and that is how would we navigate it? Okay, once we fall off the standard of care, how would we navigate the incredible spectrum of therapies, quackeries, and what have you? How would we be able to actually choose a right therapy for us? And while I think it's important to have the support from your primary center of care, I suspect that you do need somebody who is potentially unbiased or less biased, let's say, of having a larger center saying, okay, well, these are the therapies that's available, so therefore you should choose. And so rather from taking an approach from the institutional perspective, perhaps what's necessary is to have an institution or a group that's actually advocating from the patient's perspective. And I don't know where that would come from. So case in point is, how do we know that a clinical trial that might be available, let's say at sick kids, is the right one for example, Maya? Or is this something that just because the researcher is interested in promoting their clinical trial, that's what they're actually promoting? And so I guess part of the problem is, from my perspective, is who would we turn to? Do we turn to our clinicians? Well, of course, there are some biases there, and rightfully so, and that isn't to say that that's all negative. But who do we turn to? Do we turn to bureaucrats? Do we turn to politicians? Do we turn to provincial side, or do we turn to federal? Everybody has a different role they play, and from my perspective, one of the issues that I had was that there wasn't any one group that I can say, we have this problem. We have a life existentially challenged problem that we're facing, and there was nobody that we could turn to. And because of that, we were considering just about everything under the sun, okay? I mean, blue scorpion venom, really? But we were considering it because we wouldn't, like, how would we know? Okay, on one hand, we were seeing our daughter suffer through some of the most horrific side effects of the therapy. And there are therapies out there that's promising us the world, right? Okay, if you take this, then you will be fine. And here are the testimonials. How do we know that one therapy is better than the other? And we had to do a lot of research just to be able to get to a point where we can say, you know what, most likely blue scorpion venom is not going to do the job, okay? And that took a lot of effort and a lot of talking with different community members, and ultimately we gained a lot from other clinical trials members through Facebook, for example. But having said that, these are not, I mean, these people are in a similar position that we were in, and that is they were trying to navigate through their set of issues, and they were leaning on each other. Here's a case in that which I was actually quite surprised. So you're talking about a bunch of parents sitting together in Facebook and saying, we have this issue and we have that issue. And one of the parents asked, well, we were confirmed with rotavirus, and another member said, oh, don't worry about it. I don't think it's anything. And at that point, I jumped in and said, no, wait a minute here. Rotavirus is serious, and make sure that your primary team is aware of what's going on, okay? And these people all have good intentions in mind, but they weren't able to actually provide the necessary formal support that is available and should be relied upon. So it's a mixed bag. It's great that Circuits now has patient-centric, I guess, people that's available, but I don't, to be honest, I don't know what should be done, because everywhere you turn, they may not have necessarily the right perspective that represents truly what is best for the patient.
Thanks, Kirby. John Peter, do you have anything to add to that?
Can I just understand the question? You want to know what an academic research institution or a hospital can do to do what? What was the question?
Currently, we have a sort of medical backdrop where you do have to trust your physicians, your care teams, but they also have vested interests, et cetera. We hold ourselves out as a place of integrated research, learning, and clinical care. So I was just sort of asking from a perspective of how can we help you the most? Do we have a responsibility as the most integrated institutions that should know about research and know about clinical care and should know about clinical trials? Do we have an institution to provide almost some kind of service that will help you navigate when you're in this situation where you don't know where to turn, you don't know who's on your side, including perhaps your care providers, and you have too many options in front of you and very little time. So I started asking a little bit around that responsibility that we have as our tertiary care. Our governments fund us to be the best institutions in the country. What should we do to hold to that standard and help you, the patients, the most?
Well, I think there are a number of levels at which you can answer that question. On the face value of it, yes, you do have an obligation, and there are lots of places that provide this service already. Molecular Match is one, there's a whole bunch of them. And you have a responsibility to make sure that you can connect the physician and the patient in partnership with an organization that can find a clinical trial that's best matches. But I think you have there's something much more important that you can be doing, because that you can provide a challenge function, because as you probably know if you're a doctor, that one of the enemies to progress and one of the enemies to a lot of thinking is standard of care and standard of care thinking. And you have to challenge that. So your function should be to challenge the nature of, the clinical trial design, the nature of the clinical trial, the kind of experimental designs that go into it, whether you're going to use inferential statistics based on, I'll give you one slight example, and it's this. If I have a problem, I really like laxatives, okay, I just can't go a day without taking a laxative. And you have a trial that gives me a drug and gives, say, 10 people a drug to help them whip the laxative habit. And your results show you that 6 out of 10 people whip the laxative habit because they took this drug. You don't know which 6 those are. You just know that on average, 60% of the people will whip the laxative habit. And so you design all these experiments and all these clinical trial research, RCTs and so on, they're experiments. I used to teach statistics and experimental design at U of T, so I have a little bit of knowledge. They're all designed based on not knowing anything about individual differences. You cannot make a statement about an individual difference based on any of the drug research that's done, any of the trials that are made. But with precision therapies, or personalized therapies, you have a unique chance to make a statement that says, if Michelle has this particular thing, we know whether it's going to work on her, not 10 like her, but her. It requires thinking about research design differently. It requires thinking about the statistics you're going to use differently. You have to use Bayesian statistics. It requires thinking about randomization differently. It requires thinking about whether or not it's the experiments are done in real time, if they're rare diseases and so on. That's your responsibility. You should be challenging, not going along with, but challenging at every step of the way as this personalized precision medicine wave comes over medicine. And it starts to engulf and become the treatment du jour for everything. We get to genetic engineering and all that other stuff they're talking about. I won't go through all this stuff. But that's your challenge. That's a much more profound challenge, because in the long run, you will help a lot more people if they get access to things that make sense, trials that will get drugs to people faster and easier, and in a way that will make it more likely that their efficacy is going to work when it's needed to work. At a more superficial level, and I'm not denigrating it, because my wife died while we looked for clinical trials. We had to basically bull our way into getting 4 different drugs that we couldn't get through the normal trial procedures. You have the obligation to teach people and show people how to find trials. But the obligation is twofold, and the deeper one is to challenge and help progress thinking about trials.
We have time for one more very quick question, but before we move on, Tina, did you have anything to add to that conversation? You're good? One more quick question. No more quick questions? Well, no, you can't keep talking, but that was a great answer. That was fabulous. You know, I think you've learned from most of the day and from up here today that the patient and family communities have influenced incredible change, leading to quality of life, leading to saving lives by having the courage to do so and having the courage to participate in clinical trials when really they were embracing the unknown. So I think that in honor of their courage and people up here today, that we all need to embrace disruptive innovation. We need to break down silos. We need to have the courage to move forward and respect that we're all in this together and we all have expertise. Thank you very much to an incredible panel.